Once again, Barbara Walters.
After all the headlines about the horrible things the Unabomber had done, think what it would be like to suddenly discover that you might know him and that he might be your own brother. Ted Kaczynski's younger brother is about to tell us what that felt like. But first, Forrest Sawyer picks up with the Unabomber furiously working on the blueprint of what would become his own downfall.
Throughout early 1995, Ted Kaczynski had spent hour upon hour at a table in the back of the library in Lincoln, Montana, quietly writing.
The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race.
Librarian SHERRI Wood had no idea what he was writing, but she felt comfortable with this man who had, for years, befriended her 15-year-old son, Danny.
There was never any qualms with Danny about Ted. It was just Ted, and I think Ted felt that, and felt that total acceptance from this child.
There were a lot of times when I would feel real down from school or something, and he would pat me on the shoulder and tell me it was all right.
You don't think he's evil?
Sometimes I do. But the side that we knew was definitely in no way, shape, or form a mean soul.
What they could not have known was that Kaczynski had finally decided to tell the world why he was killing in a long anti-technology manifesto.
If you can get it published according to our requirements, we will permanently desist from terrorist activities.
By September 1995, after a long debate and meetings with the government, the New York Times and Washington Post agreed to meet the Unabomber's demand.
It is blackmail, pure and simple, to which the Times and the Post have acceded. Were they justified in doing so?
I'm offended by the decision of the two newspapers, but I'm outraged to hear that the American government has encouraged them to publish this thing.
Through the widespread publication of this manuscript, there is a high likelihood of people recognizing individuals that have held similar philosophies to this.
Which is exactly what happened.
You were very upset.
I was very upset.
You were so upset you didn't even tell me why, but you said...
In upstate New York, a Union College philosophy professor, Linda Patrick, David Kaczynski's wife, was alarmed to recognize some familiar-sounding ideas. But David refused to believe it.
And I found all kinds of reasons to tell her why it couldn't be Ted. I said, well, look, the guy hates to travel. He has no money. I'd never seen Ted violent. He'd never hurt a fly as far as I knew.
It just sounded so much like Ted.
The proof, said Linda, was in the manifesto itself. David read it on the internet in October.
In order to get our message before the public with some chance of making a lasting impression, we've had to kill people.
I read through a page or two and I began to feel, I suppose, a kind of coldness and then anger as well. I started thinking, if that guy has done this, how could he do this?
And now David Kaczynski was faced with a terrible dilemma.
If I gambled and made a mistake, and Ted was the Unabomber, and attacked someone else, I'd have to live with that.
But if you pursued it and made a mistake, you could do great harm to Ted.
Exactly, and that's why we wanted to get some control over the investigation, to do it in a careful way.
Very careful. For 2 months, David and his wife went over Ted's writings with a private investigator, but their fears only grew. And finally, in January 1996, David called a Washington attorney with FBI contacts, Tony BISCEGLIE.
The phone rang.
And he said that he had a brother who was mentally ill, and that he thought perhaps his brother might be the Unabomber.
David and BISCEGLIE had to decide how to approach the FBI without harming Ted unnecessarily.
First of all, his brother could have been completely innocent.
If I didn't act, other people might die. If I did act, my brother might die. Or go crazy, or kill himself.
Then, in early February, David found that 23-page essay Ted had sent him back in 1971. Withholding David's identity, BISCEGLIE gave it to the FBI.
that was a turning point in our dealings with the FBI.
Because it told you this guy has to be the Unabomber.
Yes, it did.
Well, at that point, it was very, very clear there was no turning back.
The FBI has arrested a man in Lincoln, Montana.
Just 5 weeks later, the arrest of Ted Kaczynski was national news.
Lights have been going on and off throughout the evening here, but they're off now. I would speculate that Dave Kaczynski, his wife, and his mother, if his mother is still in there, have gone to bed for the evening.
David and his family, who had been promised anonymity, found themselves under siege by hordes of reporters.
It's kind of like, you know, the family's secrets are suddenly splashed across the consciousness of the nation. At 4 o'clock in the morning, we wanted to sneak out of the house, and my mother is, at that time, 78, almost 79 years old.
I think you know more about it than I do, really.
And people are pushing bright lights in her face and shouting out the question, Mrs. Kaczynski, do you think your son is the Unabomber? All it did was cause her enormous pain for the sake, I suppose, of a kind of voyeuristic thrill.
With all the evidence found in Kaczynski's cabin, his conviction seemed assured. But David continued to hope his brother's life would be spared.
Was there ever a promise that the government would not seek the death penalty?
There was no promise, but statements were made leading David to believe that the death penalty would be inappropriate in this case, given David's remarkable cooperation and given Ted's obvious mental illness.
I actually believed until the day beforehand that they would not seek death.
But the government did, arguing there was clear evidence of deliberate, willful, and intentional malice.
Honestly, my feelings at that point were a sense of anger, feeling of having been betrayed.
As Ted Kaczynski's trial date approached, it was clear the key issue in the trial would not be his guilt, but his sanity.
One can be murderous and be mentally ill at the same time.
Dr. Karen Bronk-Froming was one of 5 mental health experts who examined Kaczynski for the defense.
We all arrived at our conclusions independently. So it was quite compelling then that we all arrived at the conclusion of paranoid schizophrenia.
Mind you, nobody's arguing that Ted should not be held responsible for what he's done. Only the argument we're making here is that this is very significant and important mitigation in a capital case.
And here people get stuck. 17 years? Ted plotted, acted out the most complicated schemes. If someone is capable of all of that, why aren't they, therefore, fully responsible for their actions?
Let's look at it another way. I think if we're reserving the death penalty for the worst of the worst, we have to realize that Ted Kaczynski did not have the capacity to understand fully what the consequences of his actions were.
These days it is fashionable to ascribe sick-sounding motivations to persons who commit antisocial acts. Perhaps some people will deny that I am motivated by a hatred for what is happening to freedom. However, I think I know myself pretty well, and I think they are wrong.
January 5th, 1998. Opening statements were to begin in Kaczynski's trial in Sacramento. David and his mother, Wanda, had not seen Ted in over 12 years.
Good morning, ma'am. Excuse me. And I didn't know what to expect. I had known that he was angry at me still. And I don't think the lawyers quite knew completely what to expect.
Did he look at you at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
In an effort to save Kaczynski from execution, defense attorneys wanted to demonstrate his mental illness. But before the trial could even begin, Kaczynski stopped it cold, refusing to allow them to refer to mental illness at all.
Why wouldn't Ted try to save his life?
I think there was something more important to Ted than his life, and that was the delusion that he was a completely sane man, rationally motivated in all of his actions, in opposition to this grand enemy, the technological society.
The judge